10 countries that dislike Americans. Right now! A nation's character is not only judged by how it treats its own, but how the world responds to its presence. Unknown. Today, that global response toward the United States is growing colder. Once seen as a symbol of freedom and opportunity, America now finds itself on the receiving end of rising skepticism and, in some cases, outright resentment. Political tensions, cultural clashes, military interventions, and economic rivalries are reshaping how the world sees the US. But which countries are pulling away the most? And why? From longtime partners rethinking their alliances to nations that see America's influence as a threat, the answers might surprise you and even challenge what you thought you knew. This is the journey of wisdom, where we explore truth with clarity and compassion. If you're ready to dive into the complex world of global opinions and shifting power, stay with us. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss the deeper meaning behind the headlines. Number 1. Brazil. For many years, the relationship between Brazil and the United States has been a mix of cooperation and tension, sometimes working as allies, other times standing on opposite sides. But in today's climate, especially in the year 2025, that relationship has entered a far more strained chapter. Under the continued leadership of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Brazil is intentionally shifting its focus eastward, strengthening ties with China and Russia and stepping away from long-standing US influence in Latin America. One of the clearest signs of this realignment is economic. Brazil now conducts over 30% of its international trade using the Chinese yuan, a bold move that signals not just financial independence, but a quiet resistance to the dominance of the US dollar. At the same time, Washington's decision to impose sanctions on Brazil's critical exports, particularly soybeans and beef, has deeply frustrated many Brazilians, who see this as economic bullying rather than diplomacy. The situation intensified further when Brazil rejected a proposed US military cooperation deal, instead choosing to deepen its defense partnership with Russia. In fact, recent reports from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute show that Brazil's arms imports from Russia have surged by 45% in just 2 years. This is not just about governments, it reflects a shift in public opinion too. A 2025 Pew Research poll reveals that only 34% of Brazilians now view the United States favorably, a steep decline from 52% just 5 years ago. As Brazil redefines its place in the world, it sends a clear message. It's choosing to walk its own path, aligned more closely with emerging global powers. For those of us watching from the outside, especially in America, this shift reminds us that respect, cooperation, and mutual understanding are crucial in today's interconnected world. In our own lives, whether in international relations or personal relationships, we might ask, are we really listening or just expecting others to follow our lead? Number 2. Saudi Arabia. Let's talk about how the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia has started to shift in a big way. For years, Saudi Arabia was seen as a key American ally in the Middle East, but that bond is unraveling. Why? Well, oil plays a huge role here. Saudi Arabia has started to push back against what it sees as US control over global economic rules, and instead it's building stronger connections with other world powers, like China and Russia. One of the biggest signals of this change came in early 2025, when Saudi Arabia made a bold move. It started pricing a big part of its oil exports in Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. This directly challenges the petrodollar system, which has been a cornerstone of America's global economic power for decades. At the same time, oil exports from Saudi Arabia to China have reached a record 2 million barrels per day, while shipments to the US have dropped by a stunning 40% over just 5 years. So, the numbers tell the story. But it's not just about money. Tensions have been rising over military issues too. The US paused certain arms sales to Saudi Arabia, citing concerns over human rights. That didn't go over well in Riyadh. In response, Saudi Arabia turned to Russia and signed a $15 billion defense deal, another big sign that the kingdom is rethinking who it calls a friend. On top of that, Saudi Arabia joined BRICS in 2024, a group that includes emerging economies like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, all looking to create a world less dependent on Western influence. These shifts show that Saudi Arabia is no longer seeking permission or approval from Washington. It's charting its own course. What does it mean when a long-time ally decides to turn elsewhere? How does this change the balance of power in the world? And what role does trust play in global relationships? One clear lesson here is this: in international politics, loyalty isn't guaranteed. It must be nurtured with respect, fairness, and mutual benefit. As global dynamics evolve, so too must our understanding of influence and partnership. Number 3. In Mexico. Let's take a moment to reflect on the evolving relationship between Mexico and the United States. One that has always been layered with complexity, history, and shared borders, but now in 2025 is showing signs of serious strain. If you're someone who follows international affairs or simply wants to understand why Mexico's attitude toward Americans seems to be shifting, it helps to look deeper into the causes, not just the symptoms. The roots of this tension lie in a mix of economic shifts, political disagreements, and growing cultural distance. Mexico, once deeply tied to the US through trade and diplomacy, is now intentionally diversifying its alliances. Did you know that China has now overtaken the US as Mexico's largest trading partner, with over $130 billion in annual trade? That's not a small change. It's a bold strategic move. What message is Mexico sending here? As the US tightens its border policies and continues to take a hardline stance on immigration, Mexico sees these actions as aggressive and disrespectful. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has openly criticized Washington's approach, calling it hostile and incompatible with mutual respect. The tension isn't just limited to politics and borders, it extends into security and industry too. Mexico has begun inviting Russian and Chinese firms to participate in building its energy infrastructure, areas that were once dominated by American companies. This shift signals a deeper realignment, a desire for autonomy, and perhaps a form of quiet resistance against what is often perceived as American dominance. And here's something worth reflecting on. If relationships are built on trust and mutual benefit, what happens when that balance is broken? As the Buddha once said, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. Could a softer approach from both sides restore understanding? Or are we witnessing the slow unraveling of a long-standing partnership? Think about how deeply trade, politics and respect intertwine in the relationships between countries. And ask yourself, in the modern world, is influence something to be demanded or something to be earned through compassion and cooperation? If you've watched up to this point, you're clearly curious about how the world views Americans today. Comment below with global eyes to show you're open to understanding different perspectives. Stick around. There's more eye-opening info ahead that might just change how you see international relations. Don't miss what's coming next. Number 4. South Africa. South Africa's relationship with the United States has long been marked by a quiet distance, but recent years, especially as we step further into 2025, have revealed a striking shift that speaks volumes about the global changes unfolding today. As a prominent member of the BRICS alliance, South Africa is now more firmly aligned with nations like China and Russia, not just economically, but politically and militarily as well. This pivot isn't random. It reflects a growing frustration with what South Africa sees as Western dominance, particularly in global trade, foreign policy, and influence over African matters. In a bold move, South Africa chose not to support US-led sanctions on Russia, deepening its cooperation with Moscow instead. So much so that trade between the two countries has reached record highs, crossing $3.5 billion in 2025. At the same time, US efforts to sway South African policies, especially those tied to African governance and regional stability, have only deepened the divide. Pretoria has accused the US of neo-colonial tactics, particularly criticizing American military involvement across the continent. This resentment isn't just political. It has sparked public outcry, with large-scale protests erupting in major cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town, where people march not just against policy, but against what they perceive as a lack of respect for African sovereignty. A recent Ipsos poll shows that only 27% of South Africans hold a favorable view of the United States, signaling a clear and growing discontent. For those listening, this isn't just about politics between nations. This is a reminder that trust and respect on the world stage are earned, not assumed. In today's interconnected world, how we treat others, whether as individuals or as countries, matters more than ever. It's a call for humility, for listening more than dictating, and for realizing that influence comes not from power, but from genuine understanding and partnership. Number 5. Turkey. Let's talk about Turkey, a country that has long stood at the crossroads of East and West. Yet in 2025, it's becoming increasingly clear that its path may be turning away from the United States. For years, Turkey and the US have had a complicated relationship, like two friends who agree on some things but argue on many others. Turkey, once seen as a pillar of Western influence in the Middle East due to its NATO membership, is now stepping into a more independent role under President Erdogan. One major point of conflict? Turkey's decision to go ahead with buying more Russian S-400 missile defense systems, even though the US warned that doing so would lead to consequences. And it did. Washington slapped on more sanctions, which only widened the gap between the two nations. But it doesn't stop at defense. Economically, Turkey is leaning more toward China, with trade between them shooting past $50 billion every year. And now, Turkey's even looking into joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is led by China and Russia, a clear message that it's exploring new alliances. What does this all mean for everyday Turkish citizens? Well, many aren't too fond of the US right now. A recent poll in 2025 showed that 68% of Turkish people see the United States as a threat to their national security. That's a huge number, and it reflects a deeper shift happening not just at the leadership level, but in the minds and hearts of the people. So here's something to reflect on. How do global politics and national decisions affect the way everyday people feel about other countries? And what happens when old alliances no longer serve the interests of both sides? The lesson here is that relationships between countries, much like between people, depend on trust, respect, and shared values. When those things fade, new paths are chosen. And those choices ripple out in powerful ways. Number 6. China. Let's talk about something that's shaping the world right now. China's growing friction with the United States. This isn't just a political rivalry, it's become a full-blown global shift that affects you more than you might think. You see, in 2025, tensions between Beijing and Washington have surged to new heights, and China has taken some bold steps to challenge America's dominance. Economically, China is pushing hard to replace the US dollar with its own currency, the yuan, as the go-to for international trade. And it's not just talk. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Russia are already trading in yuan instead of dollars. On top of that, China's been promoting its digital currency, the ECNY, since 2020, and it's now gaining real traction. But the economic battlefield is only one part of this complex story. Have you wondered what's happening in the South China Sea? China's been rapidly building up its military there, setting up new bases and sending out more patrols than ever. At the same time, the situation with Taiwan is extremely tense. China sees it as its own territory, and the US keeps selling arms to help Taiwan defend itself. This back and forth is pushing both sides closer to a dangerous line. And while all this is happening, China isn't just catching up in technology, it's aiming to lead. From artificial intelligence to quantum computing and even future 6G networks, Chinese companies like Huawei and Alibaba are proving that US sanctions haven't stopped their rise. In fact, they're still expanding fast across global markets. What's even more striking is how everyday people in China are feeling. National pride is surging, and a recent poll showed that nearly 9 out of 10 Chinese citizens believe the US is actively trying to block China's rise. That kind of public belief fuels even stronger support for their government's actions. So here's the real question. How does all of this shape the future of global power? Could China truly become the next superpower? And if it does, what might that mean for the world and for you? Let that thought settle for a moment, because as we move forward, this isn't just a story about two governments. It's a story about where the world is heading and what role each of us will play in it. Thanks for watching this far. It means you're not afraid to face uncomfortable truths. Drop a real talk in the comments if you're ready to explore global opinions with an open mind. There's still more to uncover, so keep watching and see what other surprises are in store. Number 7. Iran. Let's talk about Iran. Because if we're looking at countries where tensions with the United States are at a boiling point in 2025, Iran absolutely stands out. You might be wondering, why is the relationship so strained now? Well, a big part of it comes down to shifting alliances and unresolved disputes that have been simmering for decades. Iran has recently stepped up its military ties with two major powers, Russia and China. In fact, Iran just closed a $10 billion arms deal with Russia, bringing in advanced fighter jets and missile defense systems that have raised serious alarms in Washington. At the same time, Iran has signed a sweeping 25-year agreement with China that goes way beyond just politics. It involves heavy Chinese investment in Iran's infrastructure and oil sector, making China Iran's largest oil customer, accounting for nearly 40% of its oil exports. That's a huge shift, and it reduces Iran's reliance on Western markets. But perhaps the most explosive issue is still Iran's nuclear program. After years of stalled talks and unmet expectations, negotiations completely broke down in 2025. Iran not only rejected the latest US proposals, but has also moved forward with expanding its nuclear capabilities, something that's setting off alarm bells for global security experts. The US responded with new sanctions, but they've done little to stop Iran's nuclear progress. Now, here's where things get even more intense. Public sentiment in Iran toward the US is deeply hostile. We're talking about widespread government-backed protests where crowds openly denounce US policies. And a recent Gallup poll from 2025 found that over 85% of Iranians see the United States as a hostile force. That's not just a political issue, it's a cultural one too. So, when we think about Iran's growing partnerships with countries that are often at odds with the US, like Russia and China, we start to see how deep and complex this divide really is. What do you think it would take to change this trajectory? Can two nations with so much mistrust still find a path toward dialogue? Or has the gap grown too wide? Let that question sit with you as we move on to the next country. Number 8. Russia. In 2025, tensions between the United States and Russia have reached one of their most volatile points since the Cold War, with both nations now locked in a fierce geopolitical rivalry that extends beyond borders and into the global stage. The roots of this animosity grew deeper following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a move that solidified the divide between Moscow and Washington. What makes this divide even more complex today is how Russia has strategically adapted to years of economic sanctions. Instead of folding under pressure, Russia has pivoted, deepening its economic ties with nations like China, India, and the broader BRICS coalition. Together, Russia and China have introduced a new financial system designed specifically to sidestep the US-dominated SWIFT network, allowing for more financial independence and effectively reducing Washington's economic grip on global transactions. This shift isn't just about money, it's about power, influence, and who gets to set the rules in a changing world. Meanwhile, Russia's military ambitions haven't slowed. In fact, they've intensified. Moscow has bolstered defense ties with countries that openly challenge Western influence, such as Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela, providing them with advanced weaponry and strategic support. Intelligence reports even suggest that Russia is quietly expanding its military presence across parts of Africa and Latin America, regions historically influenced by the US, marking a significant pivot in the global balance of power. This is not just about troop movements or weapons. It's about asserting dominance and reshaping alliances in a multipolar world. What perhaps cements the growing divide most is the Russian public's perception of America. Fueled by state-controlled media, a staggering majority, according to a recent 2025 Levada Center poll, now see the United States not as a partner or even a rival, but as a threat bent on weakening their nation. This sentiment isn't born in isolation. It's the result of years of messaging, political narratives, and lived experience under sanctions and international isolation. As Russia continues to challenge US influence in regions far from its borders, from cyberspace to strategic alliances, it becomes clear that the animosity isn't just political, it's deeply cultural, emotional, and systemic. For those of us watching from afar, this unfolding drama is more than news. It's a reflection of the fragile state of our world. In modern life, it reminds us how interconnected and yet deeply divided nations can be. For everyday people, it's a call to stay informed, think critically about global narratives, and remember that behind every government stance, there are millions of individuals trying to live their lives amid the tension. It's a moment to reflect, not only on international relations, but on the values we uphold in our own communities. Respect, dialogue, and compassion, even when the world seems to be pulling in the opposite direction. Number 9. Germany. Let's talk about Germany, a country that's long been seen as one of America's closest allies in Europe. But in 2025, that relationship is going through some serious turbulence. One of the biggest sources of tension is energy and the economy. When the West placed sanctions on Russia, Germany felt the shock more than most. Its energy costs soared, and businesses began to feel the pressure. In a controversial move, Germany decided to bring back limited energy imports from Russia, even though the US strongly opposed it. But from Germany's perspective, keeping their economy stable was more important than following Washington's lead. On top of that, Germany isn't happy with certain US trade policies either. The US Inflation Reduction Act, which favors American-made products, has upset European partners, especially Germany, who feel like their industries are being pushed aside. Berlin sees this as a shift toward economic protectionism that threatens fair competition. On the defense side, Germany is also taking a different route. Rather than depending so heavily on NATO, which, let's be honest, is largely bankrolled by the US, Germany is investing more in building up Europe's own defense capabilities. In 2025, they boosted funding for EU-led security initiatives, signaling that they want more independence when it comes to military matters. These political shifts aren't just happening at the top, they're being felt by everyday people too. A recent YouGov poll found that 60% of Germans believe the US has too much influence over Europe, and a growing number want the EU to make its own decisions without Washington always calling the shots. So what does all this mean? It shows us that even close allies can grow apart when national interests start to pull in different directions. The deeper message here is this: relationships, whether between people or nations, depend on mutual respect and understanding. When one side starts feeling unheard or overpowered, tension builds. So maybe the lesson for all of us is to keep listening, stay open, and remember that real strength comes not just from power, but from partnership. Number 10. India. For decades, India and the United States have enjoyed a cooperative relationship built on shared democratic values and a mutual interest in balancing China's growing influence. But as we move through the year 2025, that once solid bond is beginning to show signs of strain. India is no longer content to simply follow the lead of Western powers. It is stepping confidently into its own on the global stage. A clear signal of this shift is India's growing leadership within BRICS, a coalition of emerging economies that is working to build alternatives to institutions dominated by the West, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. India's active role in shaping these new financial structures marks a subtle but significant move away from automatic alignment with American interests. Economically, this change is especially visible in India's trade with Russia, which has continued to thrive despite Washington's push for global isolation of Moscow. In 2025, India and Russia set a new trade record reaching $50 billion, much of it driven by discounted oil deals that directly challenge US sanctions. At the same time, India is strengthening its military partnership with Russia, opting for a massive $7 billion arms deal instead of pivoting to US weaponry. This has frustrated American policymakers who had hoped to wean India off Russian defense systems. The divergence isn't just in defense and economics, it's technological too. While the US has urged allies to cut ties with China's Huawei over security concerns, India has chosen a more nuanced path, allowing Huawei limited participation in its fifth-generation network rollout while nurturing its domestic tech sector. From India's perspective, this is a practical decision that balances national interests and technological development. But from Washington's viewpoint, it looks like defiance. Public opinion in India reflects this cooling of warmth. According to a recent Pew Research study, favorable views of the US have fallen to 42%, down from 55% in just 5 years. This trend tells us something deeper. India is asserting its independence, not in hostility, but as a rising power crafting its own identity and alliances. For those of us watching from afar, it's a reminder that even strong friendships evolve. In modern life, we often face similar moments, where we must step back from old loyalties or expectations in order to pursue a path that better fits our growth and changing values. It's not about rejecting others, but about recognizing when it's time to make decisions that are more in tune with who we've become. Still here? That says a lot about your curiosity and courage. Type Truth Seeker in the comments to let us know you're someone who digs deeper than surface-level headlines. The rest of the video has some surprising twists you won't want to miss. Stay with us. Practical advice to consider when visiting countries that don't like Americans. When traveling to countries where sentiments toward Americans may not be particularly warm, navigating with awareness, humility, and respect becomes not just helpful, but essential. The world is a mosaic of cultures, each carrying its own traditions, sensitivities, and histories. So when we enter another space, it's wise to do so with a listening heart and an open mind. One of the first and most important things we can do is learn local customs and etiquette. Understanding how to greet someone properly, what gestures may be considered rude, and the right way to conduct ourselves in everyday interactions is not just polite, it's powerful. As the Buddha once said, a person is not called wise because they talk and talk again, but if they are peaceful, loving and fearless, then they are in truth called wise. When we make the effort to learn how others live, even in small ways, we begin to dissolve the us versus them thinking that so often fuels misunderstanding. Even knowing how to bow, shake hands, or remove shoes when appropriate can bridge the gap between stranger and guest. But along with understanding cultural norms, One must also learn when silence is golden. Avoiding political discussions is more than a safety tip, it's an act of respect. Politics, especially involving the United States, can be deeply personal, tied to painful histories or strong national identities. Entering those waters without full context or sensitivity can create friction where peace was possible. There's a proverb that says, "Speak only if it improves upon the silence." When traveling, especially in regions where anti-American sentiments exist, steering clear of debates about foreign policy is not cowardice, it's wisdom. It keeps doors open rather than slamming them shut. Let people talk if they wish, but listen more than you speak. As in Zen, it's often the space between the words where understanding grows. Equally important is how we carry ourselves, literally and figuratively. Blending in by dressing modestly and behaving with a quiet respect shows a willingness to adapt rather than impose. Loud voices, flashy displays of wealth, or behavior that disregards local customs can unintentionally signal arrogance, even if that's not the intent. In countries wary of American influence, this can quickly stir discomfort or even resentment. Modesty is not about shrinking, it's about harmonizing. Like a lotus born in water, blossoming unsullied, as described in Buddhist scripture, we can learn to move through the world untouched by ego, open-hearted and observant. When we shift from thinking, "How can I enjoy this place?" to "How can I honor this place?" everything changes. Being mindful of safety is also key. Not all dangers are visible. In regions where anti-American sentiment exists, scams, confrontations, or subtle forms of exclusion can arise. Staying aware of your surroundings, especially in unfamiliar cities, helps protect both body and mind. Avoid walking alone in questionable areas, and be cautious about sharing your nationality too freely. But don't let fear shrink your experience. Let it guide your awareness, not your openness. The Buddha taught, "What we think, we become. What we feel, we attract. What we imagine, we create. So keep your heart calm and your instinct sharp. Trust that wisdom and kindness create a shield far greater than paranoia ever could." Finally, and perhaps most beautifully, rely on the quiet magic of human connection. General sentiments about a nation do not define individual hearts. Many people, even in countries with strained views of America, are deeply kind, curious, and welcoming, once given the chance. Small acts of kindness, genuine curiosity about someone's homeland, language, or way of life can open doors that politics never could. Share a meal, learn a phrase, accept an invitation. You may discover that people are far more generous than the headlines would ever suggest. The Dalai Lama reminds us, "Be kind whenever possible. It is always possible." When we treat others not as representatives of a country, but as human beings with stories and dreams, we invite the same treatment in return. In today's world, where media often amplifies division and fear, our presence can be a quiet rebellion, a living example that bridges are better than walls. Each respectful interaction, each smile exchanged, is a seed planted in foreign soil, capable of blooming far beyond our journey. And so, whether you're stepping into a bustling market in Istanbul, sipping tea in a Hanoi alley, or simply walking the side streets of a town wary of your passport, remember, you are not just a visitor. You are a student of the world. Travel not with the pride of where you're from, but with the humility of how much there is still to learn. In doing so, you not only protect yourself, you honor others, and you carry forward a ripple of peace that speaks louder than any flag. As we've seen, global opinions of the United States are shifting in real time, shaped by history, policy, culture, and the deeply human need to feel heard and respected. Behind every headline is a story, and behind every story, people, just like us, trying to make sense of a changing world. At the Journey of Wisdom, we believe understanding others is the first step toward real connection. Whether through travel, conversation, or reflection, may we all choose to listen more, judge less, and walk this world with humility and compassion. If this video gave you something to think about, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the Journey of Wisdom. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming explorations into the deeper truths behind global events and human experience. Until next time, travel kindly, think deeply, and stay open to the wisdom all around you.